It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Trust me, after you see Won't You Be My Neighbor, you'll be singing along with me too. If you grew up in the city of Pittsburgh, then you know the name Fred Rogers. He's an icon, and his show is one that'll live on for generations. If you're unfamiliar with the man I'm talking about, he ran a show called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from the 1960s up until 2001. The show is simply about a friendly neighborhood man in the city of Pittsburgh who had a bunch of friends. He liked to talk to kids and teach them everything that was going on in the world. And he did this with his puppets and friends that visited and just talking directly to the kids. This is something at the time that was really unprecedented. From this documentary, we see that Fred Rogers was ahead of his time by a landslide. And really, the funny thing is, we haven't even caught up to where he was, with the level that Fred Rogers was on. You see, Fred Rogers wasn't really into the Cartoon Networks or Nickelodeons. Of course, many of those networks weren't really around at the start of his show, but he didn't like those Saturday morning cartoons. He didn't think that it taught kids anything. He wasn't a big fan of the silly action and hitting people on the head and the fart jokes. That wasn't Fred Rogers. Fred Rogers talked to the kids as if they were adults. He thought that they should understand things. And so this documentary actually takes a look back at Fred Rogers' life. And it starts out in the 1960s whenever he's just getting started in television. His parents thought he was a little bit crazy getting started in the industry, but obviously it paid off. Fred Rogers was an ordained minister, and he had the mission to teach kids. And he did this in a lot of unconventional ways. One way he did this is through his puppets, and this was his main form of communication with kids that he actually used on and off the show whenever he met up with kids. And actually, even when he was doing interviews in real life on adult TV. We learn a lot about Fred Rogers throughout this entire documentary, from his family, friends, cast, and other people on the show. One thing that remains constant and that they all say is Fred Rogers was the man that you saw on TV. There was no fakeness about him. He preached kindness, but that's also what he showed. One son even called him the second coming of Christ, because that's what people saw him as, because he was that kind of a person. But like I said, it's crazy looking back at this show and seeing what Fred Rogers taught at the time. He talked about deep subjects with kids, and adults often went to him and asked him for parenting advice. He talked about the JFK assassination on television. That's something that would never even be discussed as a topic on TV nowadays. Imagine SpongeBob or whatever silly shows are on Disney Channel right now. And yes, Fred talked about a lot of other fun subjects, such as math and science and how long a minute is. One of the best things that Mr. Rogers does is show without telling kids directly. One example of this is when he has Officer Clemens, who's a black man, and he sits him right next to him in a chair outside and says, "You know what? Come sit with me. Put your feet in the same pool that I'm putting my feet in." He's showing kids that it's okay to be kind to each other, even if you have different skin color. He doesn't directly come out and say it, but that's exactly what he's inferring. That's what he wants to show the kids. One emotional part of this documentary, which is really great to see, was when one of the actors, Officer Clemens, Francois Clemens, came back and he discussed what it was like to work with Mr. Rogers. You see, Francois was a gay man, and back in the 1960s, that was not okay, and he was not even allowed to come out. He was married at the time to a woman. And Francois details a story when Mr. Rogers is telling Francois, Officer Clemens, just how special he is and how much he cares about him. And after they got off set, he asked Fred, he said, "You were talking to me, weren't you? Not Officer Clemens." And Fred said, "Yes, yeah, I was." And it just gets you to think that he really cares about all these people. And as kind as he was, one of the things that the documentary brings up is maybe Fred wasn't that happy. He had a very tough childhood, is kind of what this documentary hinted at. I would have loved to dive deeper into that. Like I said, the documentary started in the 1960s, but we don't see anything before that. So we don't know what happened to Fred in his childhood, that he has these repressed feelings, and maybe he was bullied a little bit, and maybe that's why he wants to make all these children understand that they are special no matter what anybody else says. And he really feels that sadness up until possibly his death. He questions if he made a lasting impact. And if this documentary shows one thing, it's that he did make a lasting impact. Fred loved in the face of hate. He showed kids how to care. Fred was the man that we should all strive to be every single day, especially today in this country. We should care about one another, no matter our skin, race, sexuality, or political party. Now, I will say I'm very happy that director Morgan Neville didn't dive into the politics of nowadays and seeing what would Fred Rogers think about our world today. That's something that I think will make this documentary live on, that it didn't dive directly into that. It hinted at a little bit, but it didn't go anywhere near it. But I do wonder what Fred would think of today's world. In my opinion, after watching this documentary, I think he'd tell us to care for one another because it's the right thing to do. So as you may be able to tell, I loved this movie. It was extra buttery. Everything about it was great. The interviews, the character stories into what Fred Rogers was all about. I loved seeing it all. To me, it's one of the best movies of 2018, and you should go check it out immediately. I included links in the description to rent the movie on Amazon and iTunes. So you go check it out and then come back here and comment what you thought of the movie. I'm interested in seeing what you would think and if a show like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood could exist in a world today. If you like this video, I'd appreciate it if you share it with your friends and subscribe to check out more reviews coming soon.